Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our webinar is Immune Hypersensitivity to Foods. Our speaker is Dr. Wayne Sedano, Director of Clinical Support and Education for Evexia Diagnostics. My name is Michelle Holmes. I'm the Director of Client Relations for Evexia Diagnostics, and will be your moderator for this evening. Dr. Sedano is a chiropractic physician, a diplomat of the American Board of Chiropractic Internists, a diplomat of the American Clinical Board of Nutrition, a certified functional and integrative medicine practitioner. He is board certified in traditional naturopathy. After graduating from Texas Chiropractic College and Rutgers University in 1985, Dr. Sedano began treating patients in private practice while continuing postgraduate studies through Logan College, Townsend State University, and the Institute for Functional Medicine. In 2005, his focus shifted to teaching for the American Board of Chiropractic Internists, which led to his dedication to research and development in the areas of integrative and functional medicine. Dr. Sedano is the Director of Integrative Medicine Education for the College of Integrative Medicine and lectures and teaches throughout the world. Before we begin, I would like to encourage all of the participants to send any questions you may have during the webinar. Please type your questions into either the chat or question box and send to organizer. We will respond to those questions before the end of presentation and allow extra time if needed. A common question is where you can find the recording of this webinar. I will send you a link tomorrow, and it will be also available on our website. You will find it by logging into your account and going to Client Services. If you're not already a client, please go to our website, www.evexiadiagnostics.com, and click on Become a Client to join us. I will now turn over the presentation to Dr. Sedano.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. So as you can read on the slide, tonight's webinar is about immune hypersensitivity to foods, and we're going to try to answer the question, why foods? And I'm also going to talk about the FIT test, and that stands for Food Inflammation Test. So let's get started. Pardon me. I don't know why that did that. There we go. Pardon me. Okay, so let's take a look at this first slide. I just want to start up here with Hippocrates over 2,000 years ago, because he's known to have stated that all disease begins in the gut. Most of you already know this, but there is a relationship to gut disorders, especially leaky gut, and immune hypersensitivity to food. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the slides. Next is what the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease has to say about food allergy. And as it reads on the slide, food allergy, that's an adverse health effect that's arising from a specific response that occurs reproducibly to exposure to a given food. And what they're talking about is a food allergy, and that's the immediate type 1 reaction, as you see on the slide, and it's the immunoglobulin G that's produced. And about 4 to 8% of the population have this immediate hypersensitivity IgE reaction. Those are the ones that can very well get you into the hospital. And tonight we're talking about food sensitivities, not food allergies. So I definitely want to make a distinction, particularly as it relates to the FIT test. Now, speaking of the FIT test, again, which is the food inflammation test, what that test does, it looks for food sensitivities, not the IgE, but the IgG reaction. And it also looks at a reaction called complement, which is part of the immune system. So you're getting a double look at each food if it produces an IgG, an immunoglobulin G, but it also activates complement, which is really the special feature of this test. Now, just to reiterate, the FIT test does not measure the IgG immediate reaction. That requires a separate lab test, as you're probably well aware of. So let's talk about hypersensitivity reactions to food. I just want to kind of set the plate for you as we look at the 4 major types. As it says on the top, the FIT checks for type 2 and type 3 reactions. Very powerful. So type 1 I already talked about. Of course, that is that immediate IgE reaction, the anaphylactic reaction. And just to kind of put down what, let you know what that one does, that's that immediate reaction. And those are, the IgG immunoglobulin activates what's known as mast cells or basophils, and then those cells will degranulate, and they're going to release chemicals that you're probably very familiar with, histamine, serotonin, and also proteases. But there's also secondary mediators of inflammation that they release as well. You may have heard of leukotrienes and prostaglandins and also bradykinins. Those are inflammatory substances that are released in that immediate reaction and can certainly get you into the hospital if you have a severe reaction like a severe bee sting or a food reaction to shellfish and so forth. Again, that's not the one we're going to be talking about that the FIT tests for. Now, the second type, as you see here, that is known as the antibody-mediated hypersensitivity, type 2, which is also known as the cytotoxic antibody reaction. And just like it says on the slide, what happens is that there's antibodies against antigens, which are foreign proteins, and they're on the surfaces of cells, or they can also be on other tissue as well. Now, here's what happens. Those antibodies, they're going to trigger what's known as complement, and I'll explain what that is in an upcoming slide. It's part of the immune system. It complements the immune system. I might just do it here just a little bit. What complement does is it's proteins that the body produces, particularly the liver, and it puts a target on particular cells so that the natural killer cells, the NK cell, and macrophages can go ahead and devour the tissue. That is that type 2 cytotoxic reaction. It is a delayed reaction. So keep that in mind. That's the one that the FIT test will check for, the type 2, and also the type 3, which I want to talk about. Those are the immune complex mediated reactions, type 3. Here's what happens is these immune complexes, what are those? Those are antibodies that are attached to the food protein, right? So it forms this complex, and that triggers inflammation, and that can activate complement. So what generally happens is that complement, it can induce that immune response. In other words, fire up the neutrophils. So if you can imagine that this complement complex, the food with the antibody, can get into the tissue, deposit it into the tissue, the immune system fires up and say, hey, this doesn't belong there. And then it calls the neutrophils in and other aspects of the immune system to try to devour the tissue that it's attached to. Now, you're going to see that a lot in autoimmune disease, particularly rheumatoid arthritis is one of the vectors that this type 3 reaction is associated with. Also lupus as well. So do you want to check for food reactions for individuals with autoimmune disease? I think so, based on that alone. The fourth type of reaction, which is not checked for in the FIT test, is called cell-mediated reaction. And that is that the antigen, there is a specific T cell or thymus cell, which is a lymphocyte, that is specific for the antigen or the foreign protein. And what happens is that T cell becomes activated, and I'll show you a picture of that later, and it calls the macrophages into play to destroy tissues. That type of reaction is very common in tissue destruction for celiac disease, problems with gluten, and there's also possibly an association with cow's milk and the pathogenesis of type 1 diabetes. All three of these, type 2, 3, and 4, are delayed reactions. And finally, on the bottom, remember that the FIT does not test for food intolerances, which I'll talk about. With a food intolerance, by the way, there is not an immunological response. An example of that would be lactose intolerance. That's a problem with not having an enzyme to digest lactase, say in milk. But you can still have an association of food intolerances with food sensitivity, so keep that in mind. So you may want to test your patients that have food intolerances because there is an association to food hypersensitivity as well. So let's talk a little bit more and encapsulate this FIT test, what you're looking at. And here is what I think is the magic of this test, because it has, I believe, improved sensitivity over the majority of other food sensitivity testing, because it takes two different measurements. It looks at the immunoglobulin G, and that is immunoglobulin G1 through G4, because there's 4 subclasses of that. It also looks at this immune complex. Now remember, that's the antibody with the foreign protein or the antigen associated with complement, those proteins that paint targets on tissue for the immune system to go after. So basically, you're getting a double look at the sensitivity of a food or the sensitivity of this particular panel. And here's how this works. If there's a food allergen or a foreign protein, that can enter the bloodstream via leaky gut, by the way, and then that can stimulate the production of antibodies, in particular IgE, but it can also produce IgM. Now, these antibodies are going to get released into the bloodstream, and then they can bind to the antigens. So that's your immune complex. These can get deposited into the tissue. Now, that deposition of the immune complex, which is that foreign protein the body doesn't like, associated with that antibody, IgG in this case, that can activate complement, painting a target on the tissue. And that's what causes tissue destruction, because it tells the immune system, go after this. And that's what the FIT is going to give you, that particular information, both looking at immunoglobulins and also that complement complex, the immune complex with the complement. Very powerful two-signal test, which I really like. On the bottom, you'll see that the FIT can also check for zonulin, which is for leaky gut. And like I said in the beginning of this, keep in mind that leaky gut is certainly associated with food sensitivities and vice versa. So here's a look at some symptoms that are associated with this IgG delayed hypersensitivity reactions. I'm not going to read all of them for you, and by the way, you can get a copy of these slides as well and then take a look at it. Certainly systemic symptoms, weakness, fatigue, digestive symptoms that runs the gamut: abdominal pain, bloating, nausea, vomiting, lung problems, certainly food-induced bronchitis and asthma. We know patients come in with that as well. Joint pain, very common. I placed an arrow on the skin, particularly, eczema and psoriasis. In my practice, I will not treat a patient without having the benefit of looking at a food sensitivity test, because it's that powerful when it comes to looking at eczema and psoriasis. So I suggest ordering that for your patients that have skin problems, and along with these other problems as well. Also brain fog, memory problems, behavioral problems as well. That's all part of that leaky gut, the gut-brain connection. Another reason to order this type of test, as well as others, but there's a lot of power here. Now back to that complement again, I kind of gave it away as well, but just to clarify that it complements the immune system. It's a group of serum proteins that activates inflammation. That's what they're testing for. Majority of these proteins are produced in the liver. The liver just makes just about everything, by the way, which is kind of cool. The complement also helps, like I said, it does opsonization. That's where it paints that target on that foreign protein for destruction by the immune system, either by the macrophages, neutrophils, and so forth. So that's what I wanted to get into, just a little bit more detail so you understand what complement is. Now, the zonulin test that is done not only on the FIT test but on other tests. This is a great test to have because of the connection to leaky gut. The thing you need to remember is that gliadin and intestinal pathogenic bacteria and others as well, it could be parasites as well, they're the main triggers of zonulin release. So what they do is they cause an upregulation of the expression, the DNA, the genetic expression. This substance called zonulin gets increased. There's receptors on the cells of the intestinal wall, right, that receive the zonulin, and once they dock onto these receptors, it opens up the enterocytes and allows for food and foreign substances to pour into the immune system and pour into the bloodstream, causing an immune reaction. In this case, you see a lot of autoimmune diseases associated with that. Of course, we know the association between celiac and type 1 diabetes. But zonulin increase is also associated with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1, diabetes, adult glucose intolerance, inflammatory bowel disease, particularly Crohn's disease. I'll show you a slide on that, asthma, MS, and probably a lot more. So that's why you want to do it. Now, this is kind of a fun slide. There's a lot going on in this slide, but let's go step by step, and I'll slow down because I've been accused of talking entirely too fast. So I'll slow down on this one for just to make sure we drive the point across. Right here, as you look across the slide, okay, this is the gut lumen up here. Right? That's where the food hangs out. This is the single layer of epithelial cells of the gut, the enterocytes, and this is inside, right underneath the cells, the lamina propria. So let's start with number one. Number one is the food and/or additives that enter the gut. So they've been ingested. Two, as we go here, there is a formation of this immunomodulatory and inflammatory fragments of the dietary peptides. Let me give you an example and break that down. If food is not broken down by the stomach and then by the pancreatic enzymes and some of the small intestine enzymes to dipeptides, tripeptides, or just amino acids themselves, they can become antigenic. So if there is hypochlorhydria, pancreatic insufficiency, the food does not break down properly, and it can become antigenic because the small intestine does not want to see anything larger than 3 amino acids strung together because it becomes a foreign substance. So if that happens, okay, and that's what you see right here, there's a connection to these little receptors that I talked about. You see one connecting here, one connecting here. That opens up the junction between the tight cells and allows that foreign protein to get right underneath the lamina propria, and that's where a lot of the immune system lays, in particularly this thing called an antigen-presenting cell, and it's named appropriately because this becomes an antigen, a foreign substance. This cell recognizes it and then it presents it to a T cell, which is a lymphocyte. And this is a naive T cell, meaning that it has never seen any other foreign protein before. And then that sends a signal inside the cell, and it does a couple of things. It goes to number 8. It can induce cell-mediated, that's the type 4 immunity. Those are those killer cells that can start damaging the gut lining. In this case, you see it here. And it also can activate B cells. Now, the B cells are the ones that produce immunoglobulins. And right, you see here, and that goes to 10, right? The production of antibodies against the tight junctions and the production of immunoglobulin G and also immunoglobulin M against the dietary peptides. As these things begin to form, then these immune complexes start forming. Now, what are those? Those are the foreign substance here that hook up with the antibody, IgG in particular. They get deposited into the tissue. The tissue says, you don't belong here. It activates complement for help, brings the troops in. They paint a target on it. And then other cells of the immune system will start to attack that and destroy these immune complexes along with other tissue. And that creates the symptom, So hopefully I broke this down where it's reasonably understandable. I know there was a lot going on there. Now, foods that are tested for on the FIT test, there's dairy, grains, fruits, additives such as aspartame, benzoic acid, BHA. You're going to see that a lot in cereals as a preservative, MSG, polysorbate 80, red dye number 3, red dye number 40, and then saccharin, and then yellow dye number 6. All those are tested for as well, which is a really good thing because there can be a reaction to the additives as well, as you probably all well know. And then vegetables, beans, spices, fish, meats, nuts, extracts, microbes right here. If you get candida showing up on this food inflammatory test, you can be pretty rest assured that there's probably candida overgrowth and also leaky gut because it had to get through the gut to cause an IgG response and an immune and a complement response as well. So you probably know that you're dealing, just on that alone, that you're dealing with some type of leaky gut because the candida worked its way through. So this slide discusses, I get a lot of questions on, okay, what's so great about this test as opposed to all of the other tests? I'm going to let you make the call, but I will tell you that I like this test quite a bit. I ran it myself several weeks ago, and I've had good success with this, so I'm very happy with this test. So let me explain this type of food sensitivity test as opposed to the other ones that I know that are out there. First, and you've heard this probably about 4 or 5 times already, the FIT test, it's going to look at the IgG 1 through 4, and it's also going to look at those immune complexes that I talked about with complement. So you're getting a two-pronged or two-signal approach to food sensitivity testing. And what that's going to do is going to narrow the field down to the foods that are definitely positive because it's looked at in 2 different vectors. So that means that you're going to get clinically useful information and avoid a lot of the false positives. I believe if you've ordered food sensitivity tests before, sometimes you'll get a laundry list of foods coming through, and it's like, okay, I'm reacting to everything. What do I do? This narrows the field down to foods that are clinically useful and clearly positive based on the complement reaction and also IgG 1 through IgG 4. Now, the next type of food allergy test, I won't mention any names of companies, we don't need that, but if it's just checking for IgG or IgM or IgA, right, what can happen is you're not getting, first of all, the look at the complement. Second thing that can happen is chronic stress can lower the immune system. An immunocompromised patient will have less formation of immunoglobulins. It makes sense. If there's GI dysbiosis, gastrointestinal dysbiosis, that can lower the production of secretory IgA, immunoglobulin A. And there's also a condition that is quite common. It's known as selective IgA deficiency. In other words, the patient genetically does not make enough IgA. So if they're looking for that and they have this deficiency, the test is not going to give you as much quality information as you would need. Now, there's 2 other type of tests that look at the reaction of white blood cells, one via a response to a white blood cell, which does not measure the IgG or the complement. So they're looking at, in other words, they're putting the antigen in this little vial and seeing if the basically the white blood cell, he does the twist. It starts moving around and it's okay, that cell is reacting to it. That's a reaction type test. It's an indirect test. Another is looking at the white blood cell, if it is secreting mediators of inflammation, meaning cytokines, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins. And they're saying, okay, these cells secreted these mediators with this particular food, so it's positive. Again, another indirect measurement. So you make the call. I do like looking at the IgG1 to IgG4. It's hard copy, and also with the complement, I think it's a win-win. So now we mentioned in the beginning, why food? What is the deal with food? Why in the world should we react to food? Because the immune system doesn't usually mistake food for an aggressive allergen, and here's the reasons why I've listed on the slide. First of all, cooking denatures foods. In other words, it opens it up. It kind of straightens it all out into amino acid chains, those polypeptides. That's one reason. Another is that there's proteolytic enzymes. They're going to cleave those proteins, those long polypeptide chains, into tripeptides, which are 3 amino acids tied together. 2 amino acids, the dipeptides, and amino acids. In that form, the amino acids and the dipeptides and tripeptides are generally easily absorbed and are generally non-antigenic. They are not looked upon as a foreign substance. Now, if you have a patient that has hypochlorhydria, pancreatic insufficiency, whatever proteins they're ingesting does not get broken down properly, so you end up with the food on the plate essentially ending up in their gut, and your gut says, this doesn't belong here, because it was never digested properly. Now, the third reason that food usually isn't mistaken is that you have a healthy mucosal barrier. And there's an adequate supply of secretory IgA. That is an immunoglobulin that could attach to foreign proteins, and essentially when you go to the bathroom, it goes right along out and doesn't cause a reaction, doesn't get below the enterocytes of the small intestine. So, in other words, the proteins or peptides that escape degradation or breakdown or digestion, they're prevented from entering circulation due to a very healthy immune barrier, no leaky gut, and certainly adequate amounts of that first line of defense that lines a lot of the cavities of the body called secretory IgA. That's why that's tested for a lot. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. Now, food again, what happens? Immune sensitivity to most food. Here's how it begins. I'm just going to repeat myself here. There is degradation or breakdown of the intestinal mucosa and decreased digestion. That's the perfect storm to create food allergies in and of itself, those two put together. And the reason why food is like an ideal source for foreign protein is that first of all, it has abundant antigens on it, food does, but most patients and most people, we keep eating the same foods over and over again. One of my teachers years ago told me that if you were to take an average of the different type of foods that we eat, each person does, they generally eat the same 20 foods over and over and over again. We're not eating seasonally. Before there was a refrigerator, which is actually the best way to eat. You may have heard of a rotation diet, where you're eating seasonally. We have the advantage, but it may be a disadvantage of eating whatever we want, whenever we want, not eating seasonally. So we're seeing the same antigens over and over again, which can be a source of the body saying, I don't know why you keep showing me the same thing over again. So on the bottom is a little encapsulation. If the protein is undigested, it could be food for dysbiosis, by the way. And you'll see that it has an increase in an indican test, by the way, if you're doing urinary indican. And then that can stimulate hyperactivity of the gut mucosa. We know that the intestinal lining, the gut has 70-80% of the immune system in it. So that's some of the reasons. Now, just an overview of food sensitivities. As it reads here, the food sensitivities and related diseases affect at least 10 million people worldwide statistically. This other one here, the second bullet, that the prevalence of food sensitivity has increased over 50% in adults and children over the past few years. Here is my take on this, and I can't prove this, but here's what I think is going on, is that the reason for the food sensitivities, and that is due to the toxins put onto the food. And it could be glyphosate, genetically modified food. The body does not want to see this. The gut reacts to it. You have leaky gut. the food gets into the gut, and now you have these reactions of food sensitivities. I believe that's just my, educated theory on that one. So you can, agree or disagree, that's fine. We know about the symptoms of food sensitivities. They can be skin rashes, which are very common, by the way. I already told you that if a patient comes in with eczema or psoriasis, I'm going to do a food sensitivity test. Headaches and chronic intestinal disease is certainly associated with that. One of the challenges with this food sensitivity is, the bottom bullet is this delayed food sensitivity can occur hours or days later after the food is ingested. And I believe it's days later or generally the next day that I see a lot with my patients over the last 20 years or so. Now, here's the thing. It's a hard sell sometimes for patients if you tell them they have delayed allergies because they're not making the association from a food that they ate a day ago or 2 days ago, and sometimes 3 days ago. So here's a good thing that I do with my patients, you may want to do with yours, is ask your patient to do a food diary and a symptom diary. And it needs to be done at least for 2 weeks, have them eat their food, and then they can go back and figure out, hey, it looks like those are the foods that I'm reacting to. Of course, you want to do a food sensitivity test, but that is another way where they can make that association. Either way, you need to explain that to them, which I know you can all do a good job. That gets the patient on board to recognize that there are such things as delayed food sensitivities, mainly because they're all aware of food allergies because it's been publicized so much, and it's generally can be a medical emergency. So keep that in mind. So here's the association with the gut, more overview of food sensitivity. The dysbiosis that leads to intestinal permeability. I talked about, and that's leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability. I talked about the gut-brain axis. If the diet is changed, the gut flora is changed, it's going to affect the brain and vice versa. So definitely keep that in mind. I mentioned about that the human diet has changed substantially over the years. We were used to eating short meals after harvest and eating in season, and we don't see that anymore. So therefore, we're seeing the same foods over and over again. And of course, you have genetically modified food, the strains that they've been engineered, the strains of grain have been engineered, to be resistant to pathogens and herbicides, not to mention whatever is sprayed on it. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here. So just be aware of that. This study was actually done and researched in 2017, is where this came from in an article. So when do you order this test? What's a good patient to order this on? This comes from Dr. Joel Evans, who I've come to know over the past 6-7 months or so. Really great doc, does a lot of this food allergy testing. So I'm going to latch on to what he says as well. I agree with everything that's on this slide and his recommendations. So first of all, when the patient doesn't feel well, it sounds like kind of a no-brainer, but the way I look at that is if the patient has been everywhere and done everything, they've been to the dermatologist, and you have enough information, clinical information, when you do a food allergy test, go ahead and run it. Especially if everything else has been done and you can't find something, it's a really good idea to take a look at that, at least to calm the immune system down while you fix other problems, mainly because the patient will start to feel better and it's hard copy data. If there's thyroid problems, in particular Hashimoto's thyroiditis, we know there's a connection to autoimmune disease that I mentioned before. Arthritis, brain fog, fatigue, gut issues, certainly. Dr. Evans is a big proponent of infertility and or the first trimester loss of a child to go ahead and do this because of an association with that as well. And fibroids, endometriosis, breast cancer, or other cancers. And I have a slide talking about how cancer can certainly damage due to chemotherapy, the gut lining, and if the gut lining and the immune system is in the gut, like I said, 60, 70, 80% of the immune system is in the gut. If the gut's off, the immune system is not up for the challenge, think about that, to get rid of the cancerous cells. So there's the association. So you're working on the immune system. So why focus on the gut and food reactions? So I have some questions and I'll also have the answers on here to make it a lot easier. So what organ of the body produces 3/4 of its neurotransmitters? The answer, the gut. What organ of the body has over 2/3 of the immune system? The gut. What organ of the body contains 10 times more cells than the rest of the body combined? Sorry about that, 10 times. And what I'm talking about in that one is essentially the gut microflora, the microbes that are in the gut, and that contains 10 times, which they have their own DNA, and it's the gut. And what organ of the body has a metabolic activity greater than the liver? Yes, and we're back to the gut. So there is, again, association. Look at both of those two vectors, fixing the gut, looking at food allergy, food sensitivity testing to take the pressure off the immune system, and looking for leaky gut. So once again, and I want to read this direct quote. This comes out of mucosal immunology. It was done in the magazine reference called Pediatrics 2003. So the gut mucosa is directly exposed to the external environment and taxed with genetic loads consisting of commensal bacteria, that's the normal flora in the gut, dietary antigens, and viruses at far greater quantities on a daily basis than the systemic immune system sees in a lifetime. So what that means is that the immune system of the gut sees in one day more problems, more dietary antigens, more viruses, more dysbiosis if it's there than the rest of the immune system sees in a lifetime. That's why fixing the gut, looking for leaky gut, is extremely important. Now, here are some conditions associated with the increased intestinal permeability. Most of these you already know: migraines, cholelithiasis, chronic fatigue, autoimmune disease, I mentioned that, and other organ diseases as well. So this comes out of a cancer magazine. This research was done in palliative care, by the way, in 2011. And the title of this is The Significance of Altered Gastrointestinal Permeability in Cancer Patients. And what they found out, certainly with chemotherapy, and it makes sense, that it's causing leaky gut, and that's causing food allergy, disturbance of the gut, causing the immune system changes. And it's a good idea to do a Zonulin test and also a FIT test for post-cancer treatment to fix the intestinal permeability. Also, if the patient has cancer even before, or as I would say preventive, look for these food allergies, look fixing the gut, because most of the immune system in our body is there. Now, another thing, and I mentioned this earlier about food intolerance, is that over 50% of patients with food intolerance also have increased intestinal permeability, because there is an association to food sensitivities and food-induced inflammation in reducing the risk and reducing leaky gut. So if it's, I just have lactose intolerance, it's fine, but they're also having other problems, think about increased intestinal permeability. Think about doing a food sensitivity test to calm the immune system down while you're fixing the gut, because it may not all be food intolerances causing the problem, such as lactose intolerance or a histamine intolerance. Obesity. This is extremely interesting here, and this article was done in 2008, and this talks about IgG antibodies against food antigens or foreign substances that are correlated with inflammation and intima media thickness in obese juveniles. So what is intima media thickness? Hardening of the arteries. Now remember what I said about how immune complexes, they can get deposited into the tissue. Once they do, that can fire up inflammation. It can fire up the neutrophils and macrophages from breaking down the tissue because it doesn't belong there. And the ultimate scar tissue of the body is calcium deposits. When the body finally gives up, it dumps in calcium. So what you're seeing here, and what the article had found out, just like it reads here, obese juveniles showed a highly significant increase in this thickening of the intima or the vascular wall. They had an elevated CRP and anti-food IgG antibodies. And they compared that to juveniles with normal weight and found that the anti-food total of IgG showed a tight correlation with inflammation. Well, you already know that by now, and also the thickening of the intima media or hardening of the arteries, calcium beginning to deposit somewhere along the line. So I think that's an important research and another piece of information to prompt you to want to do one of these tests. Now, IgG testing and migraines, basically there was a randomized study that was done, and if you see the spelling a little off, it's in English, probably in England here. You're going to see a crossover study with migraineurs, and this study showed that the diet restriction based on the IgG antibody was an effective strategy for reducing the frequency of migraine attacks. And I mentioned before inflammatory bowel disease and IgG. Two of the most common food sensitivities, by the way, with inflammatory bowel disease, particularly Crohn's disease, is dairy and yeast food sensitivity, so keep that in mind. So what happens is that the immune responses against these autoantigens or food antigens, they may be responsible for a perpetual inflammation in the gut. So another reason to do a food allergy test if there's inflammatory bowel disease. Now, the IgG testing and treatment, this is what's recommended when you get your tests back when you do it, because I know you're all going to do tests now. If you have patients that qualify as this, you want to eliminate the food for at least 1 month, but 2 or 3 months may be better, and you may need to go longer than that. I wrote a little note on the bottom because I have had cases where the individual needs to avoid the reactive food indefinitely. I've had those cases over the last 20 years, and we just agreed, and the patient agreed, after being away from the food, fixing the leaky gut, that they were just reactive to that food, and it's just best to stay away, particularly with migraines. I've noticed that quite a bit. So you definitely want to keep that in mind. There may be, which I haven't found a whole lot, that there may be some exacerbation before improvement, but I've generally found improvement with taking the foods away, the reactive foods, to be the case most of the time in my experience. Now, the summary of the test, it has clinical utility. Why? Because it's looking at 2 different vectors, and it's avoiding a lot of the false positives. It can prove patient adherence. And something that I also found interesting is that the elevation of some IgG, it can be evidence of underlying inflammation. And keep this in mind. The patient may say, well, I really don't have symptoms from that particular food or don't recognize it. It's showing that there is a reaction on those 2 vectors, complement and IgG. So good idea to make them aware of that, because other things may start to clear up as well. It's been my experience. The test is also helpful for prescribing a personalized diet, and particularly those that for weight loss. Very, very helpful because the inflammation is down. It can be extremely helpful for that as well. Here is a sample report of the fit. I know you probably can't see this a whole lot, so I'm going to go to the next slide. The first, very simple read, +4 highly reactive foods, which are listed here. The patient can read it real easy, +3 and +2. So the question becomes, do I just stay away from the +4s? You need to stay away from all 3 of these type foods, especially initially, and be aware that the +4s are very, more reactive. So then there'll be a readout, just like I told you about the analytes before, the dairy analytes, grains, fruits, additives, and this is the legend. Red is severe, and then orange high, yellow moderate, and then mild reaction, and no reaction negative, and the list of vegetables, beans, and spices, fish, meats, nuts, extracts, microbes. I mentioned candida again. If candida goes high on that patient, odds are they have leaky gut because it had to slip through for the immunoglobulin and complement reaction to take place, and then fowl, seeds, and shellfish. Easy to read for you and your patient. Other conditions that can benefit from this type of test I have listed here: high blood pressure, blood glucose dysregulation, also overweight and obesity, and also, telling you why when you look at that childhood obesity and the increase in thickening of the intima media, the blood vessels, you definitely want to look at that. So now, other tests, if you do find that there's leaky gut or dysbiosis going on, just be aware that at Evexia we have other tests that are helpful. There's a leaky gut test for intestinal permeability, SIBO test, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, wonderful stool analysis test that does look at DNA. Organic acid is very helpful, and also the basic and advanced test. And now, in regard to I have a nutraceutical line that I'd love to tell you about that can help restore. You've probably heard of the 4R program. Well, Evexia, we have our 4R program too. This is just a list of the 4 of the supplements, and there are many more. First one here, this GastroBalance, that has all the good natural antimicrobials, get rid of the bad bugs. The next one, this Gastro Plus, that's going to help out with with gut mucosal repair. L-glutamine's in there. D-enzymes, if there is a decrease or need for replacement of digestive enzymes. And the last one, obviously, is to help out liver and gallbladder function to get the toxins out of the body. There's also a whole bunch of lists. You can talk to your representative if you're a client or become a client of Evexia, which I highly encourage. Great discount on laboratory tests. So just a quick summary here on the FIT test. There's 132 foods. Also checks for additives. You can do it as a finger stick as well, which is easy. If you can't find a drawing station or it's difficult to get these advanced tests on a blood draw, the finger stick, in my opinion, works just as well. The report's easy for the patient. You saw that. You can tack on the zonulin as well, and it also tests for the chemical additives, which can damage the gut and gut barrier as well. So that's the summary. So I'm going to turn this over to Michelle. I thank you so much for your time, and hopefully this was informative. Well, it seems like I can't find Michelle, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you about when you go on the website, which is down here. Go to this website here, which is www.evexiadiagnostics.com, and they can talk you through on how to order the tests, the FIT test, or any of these other tests that I had mentioned. And on this slide here is the website, Evexia Diagnostics, and this is the address, and of course the phone number, 888-852-2732. So definitely give them a call. I think we may have had our moderator must have somehow got disconnected, so we'll go from there. All right, this is Dr. Sedano. Thank you so much for listening. You all have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Good night now.